Hi, I'm Sarah. At my grandmother's will reading, my cousin Jessica handed me what she called a worthless old ring with this smug little smile, like she was doing me some huge favor. Everyone else got the valuable stuff, the house, the cars, the bank accounts, while I got stuck with costume jewelry and photo albums. But when I took that ring to get it cleaned, the jeweler's face went completely white. What he told me next didn't just change my life. It exposed a family conspiracy that had been decades in the making. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The law office of Morrison Associates sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd Street in downtown Millbrook, housed in a brick building that had probably seen better days, sometime in the 1940s. The waiting room smelled like old leather and stale coffee, with burgundy furniture that creaked every time someone shifted their weight. I smoothed down my black dress, the same one I'd worn to Grandma Rose's funeral 3 days earlier, and tried to ignore the way my stomach churned with a mixture of grief and anxiety. My family filled the small space like they owned it, which I suppose they thought they did. Jessica sat directly across from me, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the arm of her chair while she scrolled through her phone. She'd driven down from Chicago in her BMW, designer handbag perched on her lap like a trophy. Everything about her screamed success, the kind of polished, expensive success that had always made me feel small and inadequate during family gatherings. Next to her sat Uncle Robert, Grandma's eldest son, checking his Rolex every few minutes as if he had somewhere more important to be. His wife Carol primped in a compact mirror, reapplying lipstick that was already perfect. Their twin boys, now in college, flanked them on either side, both wearing suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The whole family radiated this air of barely contained anticipation, like wolves circling prey. My own mother sat beside me, nervously twisting her wedding ring around her finger. She'd been quiet since the funeral, unusually so. Mom had always been the peacekeeper in the family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made excuses for other people's bad behavior. But lately, there had been something different in her expression when she looked at her brother Robert. Something that looked almost like fear. The office door opened with a sharp click, and Mr. Morrison emerged, a thin, gray-haired man in his 70s who'd been the family lawyer for as long as I could remember. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose, and his movements were careful and deliberate, like someone who'd learned to weigh every word before speaking. "Thank you all for coming," he said, settling behind his desk and opening a thick folder. "I know this is a difficult time, but Rose was very specific about her wishes regarding the distribution of her estate." Jessica straightened in her chair, that familiar calculating look flickering across her features. She'd always been Grandma's favorite, or at least, she'd always acted like it. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering, Jessica had positioned herself as the golden granddaughter, the successful one who'd made something of herself in the big city. She worked in real estate, specialized in luxury properties, and never let anyone forget how well she was doing. I, on the other hand, was just Sarah from Millbrook, 28 years old, working as a librarian at the local elementary school, living in the same small town where I'd grown up. I'd never married, never moved away, never done anything that the family considered particularly impressive. I was the granddaughter who stayed close to home, who visited Grandma Rose every Sunday for tea and homemade cookies, who helped her with grocery shopping and doctor's appointments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But apparently, that kind of loyalty didn't count for much when it came to wills and inheritance. Mr. Morrison adjusted his glasses and began reading from the document in his careful, measured voice. "To my son Robert, I leave my house on Elm Street, along with all furnishings and personal property contained therein, with the exception of specific items mentioned elsewhere in this document." Uncle Robert nodded with satisfaction, exchanging a meaningful glance with his wife. The house was worth at least $400,000, maybe more, in today's market. It was a beautiful Victorian, with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch that Grandma had lovingly maintained for 50 years. To my granddaughter Jessica, I leave my investment portfolio with Hartwell Financial, currently valued at approximately $600,000, as well as my 2019 Cadillac Escalade. Jessica's smile was brilliant and predatory. She'd been banking on this inheritance. Literally, I knew she'd been having financial difficulties lately, though she'd never admit it publicly. The real estate market had been brutal, and she'd made some bad investments. This money would solve all her problems and then some. The reading continued with smaller bequests to various family members. Carol got Grandma's jewelry collection, which included several valuable pieces that had been in the family for generations. The twins each received $25,000 for college expenses. Even distant cousins and family friends were remembered with generous gifts. And then Mr. Morrison got to me. To my granddaughter Sarah, I leave my personal collection of books, photo albums, and memorabilia, as well as the contents of my hope chest in the upstairs bedroom. My heart sank. Books and photo albums. While everyone else walked away with hundreds of thousands of dollars, I got keepsakes and memories. Don't get me wrong. I treasured those things, especially the photos and letters that chronicled our family history. But it stung to realize that in Grandma's final accounting, my years of devotion and care had been valued at essentially nothing. Jessica's voice cut through my disappointment like a knife. Oh, and Sarah, there's one more thing. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet jewelry box. Grandma wanted you to have this too. She said it was some old ring that belonged to her mother. Not worth much, but I'm sure it has sentimental value. She held out the box with that same condescending smile, the one that said she was being generous by even remembering this trivial detail. I took it with as much grace as I could muster, though inside I felt like screaming. Even the family jewelry had gone to Carol. But sure, let Sarah have the worthless trinket. I opened the box to find a ring that was, admittedly, not much to look at. The band appeared to be some kind of tarnished silver or white metal, and the stone in the center was cloudy and yellowed with age. It looked like something you might find at a garage sale for $5, but it had belonged to my great-grandmother, and despite my hurt feelings, I slipped it onto my ring finger where it fit perfectly. How thoughtful, I managed to say, forcing a smile that probably fooled no one. The meeting wrapped up quickly after that, with Mr. Morrison explaining the next steps for transferring titles and accessing accounts. Uncle Robert was already making plans to put the house on the market. Apparently, he had no interest in maintaining Grandma's beloved home. Jessica was practically bouncing in her seat, probably calculating how quickly she could access her inheritance. As we filed out of the office, Jessica caught my arm. Sarah, sweetie, I hope you're not disappointed. You know Grandma loved you dearly, but she was always practical. She probably figured you'd appreciate the sentimental items more than money anyway. The condescension in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. But what really bothered me was the way she emphasized the word practical, like there was some hidden meaning I was supposed to understand. Of course, I replied, my voice carefully neutral. The memories are what matter most. But as I walked to my car, a 10-year-old Honda that wheezed when I started it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole situation. Not just the disappointment of being essentially written out of the will, but something deeper. Something about the way Jessica had handed me that ring, like she was in on some joke I didn't understand. My mother caught up with me in the parking lot, her face pinched with worry. Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry. I had no idea Rose was going to. It's fine, Mom, I interrupted, though we both knew it wasn't. Like Jessica said, Grandma was practical. She probably thought I'd be okay with just the keepsakes. But Mom shook her head, glancing around nervously as if she was afraid someone might overhear. No, that's not. Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. Something about your grandmother and that ring. Before she could continue, Uncle Robert appeared beside us, his expression stern. Helen, we should probably get going. Kara wants to start going through the house this afternoon, and there's a lot to sort through. The way he said it made it clear that my mother's input wouldn't be needed or welcome in that process. Mom's face went pale, and she nodded quickly. Of course. Sarah, we'll talk later. But I could see in her eyes that she was scared of something, and that scared me too. That evening, I sat in my small apartment above the downtown bakery, surrounded by boxes of Grandma's belongings that I'd retrieved from the house. Photo albums dating back to the 1940s, love letters between my grandparents, recipe cards written in Grandma's careful handwriting. Each item was precious to me, but I couldn't stop thinking about my mother's aborted confession in the parking lot. I held up the ring, examining it more closely under my desk lamp. The band was definitely some kind of white metal, though the tarnish made it difficult to identify. The stone was large, probably 2 carats, but so cloudy and yellowed that it looked more like a piece of costume jewelry than anything valuable. There were no markings visible on the band, no jeweler's stamps or identifying characteristics. Something nagged at me about Jessica's explanation. If this ring had belonged to my great-grandmother, why hadn't I ever seen Grandma wear it? She'd had a whole collection of family jewelry that she'd treasured and displayed proudly. Why keep this particular piece hidden away? I tried calling my mother 3 times that evening, but it went straight to voicemail each time. That was unusual. Mom always answered her phone, especially when she knew I might be upset about something. The silence felt ominous, like another small piece of a puzzle I didn't understand yet. The next morning, I woke up with a strange determination. Maybe it was the librarian in me, the part that believed every mystery had a solution if you just knew how to research it properly. Or maybe it was just stubborn pride, a refusal to accept that I'd been relegated to the role of poor relation without at least understanding why. I decided to take the ring to Millbrook Jewelry, a small shop on Main Street that had been in business for 40 years. The owner, Mrs. Chen, had always been kind to me, and I trusted her to give me an honest assessment. Maybe the ring was worth something after all. Maybe Grandma had left me more than everyone realized. The bell above the door chimed as I entered the shop, breathing in the familiar scent of jewelry cleaner and old wood. Mrs. Chen looked up from behind the counter where she was working on a watch repair, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Sarah, dear, how are you holding up?" "I was so sorry to hear about your grandmother." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Actually, I was hoping you could help me with something." I pulled out the velvet box and opened it. This belonged to my great-grandmother, apparently. I was wondering if you could tell me anything about it, maybe clean it up a bit. Mrs. Chen set down her tools and reached for the ring, holding it up to the ban light. For a moment, her expression was casual, professional. Then something changed. Her eyes widened, and she grabbed a jeweler's loupe for a closer examination. "Oh my," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is it?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. Mrs. Chen looked up at me, then back at the ring, then at me again. Her hands were actually trembling. "Sarah, where exactly did you get this?" "It was part of my grandmother's estate. My cousin Jessica said it was just an old family piece. Not worth much. Is something wrong?" Mrs. Chen set the ring down very carefully on a velvet cloth, as if it might shatter. "Not wrong, exactly. But Sarah, this isn't costume jewelry. This isn't even just valuable jewelry." She paused, seeming to gather herself. "If I'm not mistaken, and I really hope I am, this appears to be a very rare type of diamond." My mouth went dry. "Diamond? But it's so cloudy, so yellow." "That's not cloudiness, dear. Well, I need to run some tests to be absolutely certain. But this looks like what we call a fancy yellow diamond. A very large, fancy yellow diamond." She picked up the ring again with reverence. "The yellowing isn't a flaw. It's what makes these stones so incredibly valuable. Some of the most expensive diamonds in the world are fancy yellows." The room seemed to spin around me. How valuable are we talking about? Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying the stone with her loupe again. "I don't want to give you false hope, but if this is authentic, and the setting suggests it might be, we could be looking at anywhere from 500,000 to..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "To what?" "To well over $1 million. I gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling over. $1 million. The ring that Jessica had dismissively handed me as a worthless trinket could be worth more than everything else in Grandma's estate combined. "Are you absolutely sure?" I managed to ask. "I'll need to do some tests, maybe send it to a certified gemologist for official appraisal." "But Sarah, the size, the color, the way it refracts light. She looked up at me with a mixture of excitement and concern. Where has this ring been all these years? Why wasn't it properly appraised as part of the estate? That was the question, wasn't it? And suddenly, my mother's frightened expression in the parking lot, Jessica's smug smile, Uncle Robert's hurry to get Mom away from me. It all started to make a different kind of sense. Mrs. Chen, I said slowly, I think I need that official appraisal as soon as possible. And I think I need to keep this very quiet until we know for sure. She nodded gravely. I couldn't agree more. Sarah, if this ring is what I think it is, there are people who might do quite a lot to get their hands on it. As I left the jewelry shop with the ring safely back in its box, my mind was racing. If Mrs. Chen was right, then my grandmother hadn't forgotten me at all. She'd left me the most valuable thing she owned. But somehow Jessica and Uncle Robert had either missed its significance, or they'd known exactly what it was and deliberately tried to hide it from me. I thought about Jessica's casual dismissal, the way she'd emphasized that it wasn't worth much. I thought about Uncle Robert's urgency to get my mother away before she could tell me whatever she'd been about to reveal. I thought about how quickly they'd moved to divide up the rest of the estate, how eager they were to liquidate everything. And I realized that for the first time in my life, I might have something that my successful golden child cousin wanted desperately. Something she'd tried to steal right out from under me, counting on my naivete and gratitude to pull it off. Well, Jessica was about to learn that the quiet librarian from Millbrook wasn't quite as naive as she'd always assumed. And if she thought she could manipulate me out of my inheritance, she was in for a very unpleasant surprise. The game was just beginning, and for once I held all the cards. I barely slept that night, my mind churning with possibilities and questions that seemed to multiply every time I closed my eyes. The ring sat on my nightstand in its velvet box, looking innocent enough in the dim light filtering through my bedroom curtains. But knowing what Mrs. Chen suspected about its value changed everything about how I saw it, how I saw my family, and how I saw my grandmother's final wishes. By 6 a.m, I gave up on sleep and made myself a pot of strong coffee. I needed to think clearly, and caffeine was going to be essential for what I was beginning to realize would be a very complicated day. The first order of business was getting that official appraisal. But Mrs. Chen had warned me that finding a certified gemologist who specialized in fancy-colored diamonds might take some time. In the meantime, I needed to figure out what my family actually knew about this ring. I pulled out my laptop and started researching everything I could find about valuable diamonds, inheritance law, and estate fraud. What I discovered made my stomach clench with anger and disbelief. If someone knowingly concealed assets during an estate settlement, it was considered theft. If they deliberately misrepresented the value of inherited items to manipulate the distribution, it was fraud. And if they'd been planning this deception while my grandmother was still alive, it might even qualify as elder abuse. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just a misunderstanding or oversight. Jessica's behavior at the will reading hadn't been casual dismissal, it had been calculated misdirection. She'd made sure to emphasize how worthless the ring was, how generous she was being by even remembering to give it to me. She'd been performing for an audience, making sure everyone in that room understood that Sarah was getting the scraps, while the important heirs received the real valuable items. But if the ring was worth what Mrs. Chen suspected, then Jessica and Uncle Robert had essentially stolen $1 million from me. And they'd done it right in front of a lawyer and my own mother, counting on my ignorance and their reputation as the successful members of the family to pull it off. I called Mrs. Chen as soon as her shop opened at 9 o'clock. Her voice was excited but cautious when she answered. "Sarah, I've been thinking about your ring all night. I made some calls to colleagues in the city, and I think I can get you an appointment with Dr. Marcus Webb at the Gemological Institute. He's one of the foremost experts on fancy-colored diamonds in the country." "How soon can we see him?" I asked, my fingers drumming nervously against my coffee mug. "That's the thing. He's incredibly busy, but when I described what we might be dealing with, he agreed to see you this afternoon. He's driving down from the city specifically to examine this piece. Sarah, that alone tells you how significant this could be." My heart hammered against my ribs. This afternoon? That's fast. Dr. Webb said that if this ring is authentic and of the quality I described, it represents a very rare find. Fancy yellow diamonds of this size and saturation are incredibly uncommon. Most of them are already documented and tracked by major auction houses and collectors. What does that mean for me? It means we need to establish provenance, the chain of ownership that proves this ring legitimately belongs to you. Do you have any documentation about your great-grandmother's jewelry? Any insurance records, photographs, family documents that might mention it? I thought about the boxes of family memorabilia I'd inherited, all those photo albums and letters I'd been too emotional to examine closely. I have decades worth of family documents and photographs. If there's anything to find, it would be in there. Good, bring whatever you can find to the appointment. Dr. Webb will want to see everything. After we hung up, I spread the contents of Grandma's hope chest across my living room floor. Photo albums, loose photographs, letters tied with ribbon, old jewelry boxes, and manila envelopes stuffed with documents dating back to the 1940s. It was overwhelming, but I started with the oldest materials first, working my way chronologically through my family's history. In a photo album labeled Wedding 1952, I found pictures of my grandparents' wedding day. Grandma Rose looked radiant in a simple white dress, standing next to my grandfather in his military uniform. But it was the close-up photos that caught my attention, the ones showing her hands as she and Grandpa exchanged rings. There, on her right hand, was a ring that looked remarkably similar to the one currently sitting in my jewelry box. My pulse quickened as I flipped through more pages, looking for other appearances of the ring. I found it in Christmas photos from the 1950s, in pictures of family gatherings throughout the 1960s, and in formal portraits from various anniversaries. But then, sometime in the early 1970s, the ring disappeared from the photos. I couldn't find a single image of Grandma wearing it after 1973. I moved on to the letters, carefully untying ribbon after ribbon. Most were love letters between my grandparents, sweet, but not particularly relevant to my current investigation. But in a bundle marked Important Papers, I found something that made me gasp out loud. It was an insurance appraisal from 1971, typed on official letterhead from Hartwell and Associates certified appraisers. The document was yellowed with age, but the text was still clearly legible. It described one platinum ring set with 2 3-carat fancy intense yellow diamond, surrounded by smaller white diamonds totaling approximately 0.8 carats. The estimated value in 1971 was listed as $12,000. $12,000 in 1971. I grabbed my phone and quickly searched for an inflation calculator. In today's money, that would be equivalent to about $80,000. And that was more than 50 years ago, before the market for fancy-colored diamonds had exploded. Mrs. Chen had mentioned that these stones had become incredibly sought after by collectors and investors in recent decades. But the most important detail wasn't the value, it was the description. Platinum, not silver. A fancy, intense yellow diamond, not costume jewelry. This was definitely the same ring, and there was official documentation proving it was a legitimate family heirloom of significant value. I kept digging and found more pieces of the puzzle. A letter from 1973 mentioned that Grandma had decided to put Rose's ring away for safekeeping after a break-in at their house. Another document from 1985 showed that the ring had been transferred to a safety deposit box at First National Bank. And then, most significantly, I found my grandmother's will from 1998. Not the recent one we'd heard at the lawyer's office, but an earlier version that had apparently been updated. In that 1998 will, the ring was specifically mentioned. To my granddaughter Sarah, I leave my mother's yellow diamond ring, currently held in Safety Deposit Box 247 at First National Bank. This ring has been in our family for 3 generations and should remain so. My hands were shaking as I read those words. Grandma had always intended for me to have this ring. She'd documented that intention more than 20 years ago. But somehow, in the final version of her will, that specific bequest had been removed and replaced with the vague language about contents of my hope chest. Someone had convinced my grandmother to change her will. Someone had talked her into removing the specific mention of the most valuable thing she owned. and instead hiding it among general household items that could easily be overlooked or dismissed. I thought about the past few years, about how Uncle Robert had become increasingly involved in Grandma's financial affairs. He'd convinced her to let him handle her banking, to consolidate her accounts, to simplify her estate planning. He'd been the one pushing for regular updates to her will, claiming it was important to keep everything current and legally sound. And Jessica had been visiting more frequently lately, always with some reason to spend time alone with Grandma. She'd started coming down from Chicago every few months, staying for long weekends and taking Grandma on girls' trips to various places. I'd thought it was sweet that Jessica was finally making time for family. Now I wondered what those private conversations had actually been about. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was my mother, and her voice sounded strained and nervous. "Sarah, honey, I was wondering if we could meet for lunch today. There are some things about your grandmother that I think you should know." "What kind of things, Mom?" There was a long pause. "Things about the ring Jessica gave you. Things about Robert and the way he's been handling Rose's affairs. I should have spoken up sooner, but I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared of Robert. Scared of what might happen if I interfered with his plans. But after yesterday, after seeing how they treated you at that will reading, I can't stay quiet anymore." We agreed to meet at Miller's Diner, a quiet place on the outskirts of town where we could talk without being overheard. I spent the remaining time before our meeting organizing the documents I'd found, making copies of everything, and putting together a timeline of events. Whatever my mother was about to tell me, I wanted to be prepared with my own evidence. Miller's Diner was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few truckers at the counter and an elderly couple sharing pie in a corner booth. Mom was already there, sitting in a back booth with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept much either. "Mom, what's going on?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from her. She glanced around nervously, then leaned forward and lowered her voice. "Sarah, what I'm about to tell you could destroy our family. But I think it's going to come out anyway, and I'd rather you heard it from me. Just tell me. Robert has been stealing from your grandmother for years." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean, stealing?" "He convinced Rose to give him power of attorney about 3 years ago. Said it would make things easier for her, help her avoid having to deal with banks and paperwork. But instead of just helping her, he's been systematically moving money out of her accounts and into his own investments." I stared at my mother, trying to process what she was telling me. "How do you know this?" "Because I work at the bank, Sarah. I process the transfers. I've seen the statements. Over the past 3 years, Robert has moved almost $200,000 out of Rose's accounts. He's been careful about it, taking small amounts at regular intervals so it wouldn't trigger any automatic alerts. But I've been watching, and I've been keeping records." My mouth went dry. "Why didn't you report it?" "Because he's my brother, and because I was afraid no one would believe me. Robert's always been the successful one, the one everyone trusts, with money and business decisions. And Rose seemed happy enough. She never complained about not having enough money, never seemed to notice that her accounts were shrinking." "But you noticed?" Mom nodded miserably. "I noticed, and I documented everything. I have copies of all the transactions, all the transfers. I keep them in a safe deposit box that Robert doesn't know about." "What does this have to do with the ring?" "Because the ring wasn't the only thing he was hiding. About 6 months ago, Robert came to the bank and cleaned out Rose's safety deposit box. Officially, he had the right to do it. His power of attorney gave him access. But Sarah, there were things in that box worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Family jewelry, old coins, stock certificates, bonds that had been maturing for decades. I felt sick. What happened to all of it? I think he sold most of it. He's been having financial problems, bad investments, gambling debts, IRS trouble. Carl and I think he's been using Rose's assets to cover his own mistakes. But why leave the ring? If it's as valuable as Mrs. Chen thinks, why not take that too?" Mom reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "Because I don't think he knew what it was. Look at this." She slid document across the table, a copy of the safety deposit box inventory from when Robert had cleaned it out. My eyes scanned the list. Pearl necklace, gold bracelet, silver watch, miscellaneous costume jewelry. The ring was listed simply as Yellowstone ring, unknown value. He thought it was worthless too, I breathed. Exactly. And when Rose asked about her mother's ring a few weeks before she died, Robert told her it had been lost years ago. He said he thought she'd sold it back in the 1980s when Grandpa was sick and they needed money for medical bills. So Grandma thought the ring was already gone. Right. That's why she didn't specifically mention it in her final will. She thought it no longer existed. But then, the day before the will reading, Robert found it in Rose's bedroom. It had been in that hope chest all along. She'd taken it out of the safety deposit box years ago and forgotten about it. I leaned back in my seat, my head spinning, and he gave it to Jessica to give to me because he still thought it was worthless. Exactly. It was their way of throwing you a bone, making it look like they were being generous while keeping all the actually valuable stuff for themselves. But if they find out what it's really worth… Sarah, Mom interrupted, her voice urgent. They can't find out, not yet. Not until you've secured your legal rights to it. I pulled out my phone and showed her the insurance appraisal from 1971. Her eyes widened as she read it. My God! It really is valuable. More than valuable, Mom. Mrs. Chen thinks it could be worth over $1 million. And I have an appointment this afternoon with a gemologist who specializes in fancy-colored diamonds. You have to be careful, Mom said, gripping my hand across the table. If Robert finds out what that ring is worth, he'll do whatever it takes to get it back. He'll claim there was a mistake, that it should have been part of the main estate, that you're not entitled to it. Can he do that legally? I don't know. But I know my brother, and when money is involved, he can be ruthless. He's already destroyed Rose's trust in her own memory and convinced her to change her will once. What's to stop him from trying to do it again, even after her death? We spent another hour going through everything Mom had documented about Robert's financial activities. The scope of his theft was staggering. Not just the money transfers, but forged signatures on documents, unauthorized sales of Grandma's possessions, and systematic manipulation of an elderly woman who trusted him completely. There's something else, Mom said as we prepared to leave. Jessica knows about at least some of this. I heard her and Robert talking at the funeral about how they needed to wrap things up quickly and make sure nothing complicated came to light. I think she's been helping him cover his tracks. Why are you telling me all this now? Because you're the only one who can stop them. You're the only one who loved Rose enough to fight for what she really wanted. And because I'm tired of being scared of my own brother. As I drove home from the diner, my mind was racing with everything I'd learned. Robert wasn't just a greedy relative who'd taken advantage of his elderly mother. He was a systematic thief who'd been stealing from Grandma for years. And Jessica wasn't just a favored granddaughter who'd gotten lucky with the inheritance. She was an active participant in covering up those crimes. The ring wasn't just valuable, it was evidence. Evidence that there had been assets in Grandma's estate that hadn't been properly accounted for. Evidence that the family had been systematically looted by the very people Grandma trusted most. And if I was right about the ring's value, it meant that Grandma's final gift to me wasn't just a family heirloom. It was justice. But first, I needed to prove exactly what I was holding. Dr. Webb's evaluation would tell me whether I was sitting on $1 million discovery or chasing shadows. And depending on what he found, I'd need to decide how to use that information to expose the truth about what my family had done. One thing was certain: the quiet librarian from Millbrook was about to become someone Jessica and Uncle Robert had never planned on dealing with. Someone who had evidence, documentation, and most importantly, nothing left to lose. The afternoon appointment couldn't come soon enough. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived at Mrs. Chen's jewelry shop at exactly 2 o'clock, carrying a briefcase that looked like it could withstand a nuclear blast. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a perfectly pressed suit that screamed expensive expertise. When Mrs. Chen introduced us, his handshake was firm and his eyes immediately went to the velvet box I was clutching like a lifeline. "Miss Davis?" he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades examining some of the world's most precious gems. "Mrs. Chen has told me quite a story about what you might have here. Shall we take a look?" My hands trembled slightly as I opened the box and placed the ring on the black velvet examination pad Mrs. Chen had prepared. Dr. Webb said nothing for a long moment, simply studying the piece with naked eyes before reaching for his equipment. He pulled out a jeweler's loupe that looked far more sophisticated than anything I'd ever seen, followed by what appeared to be a small microscope and several other instruments I couldn't identify. "Interesting," he murmured after his initial examination with the loupe. "Very interesting indeed." He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Miss Davis, before I continue with the technical evaluation, I need to ask you some questions about the provenance of this piece. Can you tell me exactly how you came to possess it?" I pulled out the manila folder I'd prepared, containing copies of all the documents I'd found that morning. The 1971 insurance appraisal, the photographs showing my grandmother wearing the ring, the old will from 1998, and the inventory from Uncle Robert's safety deposit box raid. Dr. Webb examined each document carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "This insurance appraisal is particularly helpful," he said, studying the 1971 document. "The description matches what I'm seeing here, and it establishes a clear chain of ownership. Now, let me conduct the technical examination." What followed was the most tense hour of my life. Dr. Webb used instrument after instrument, measuring, weighing, photographing, and testing various aspects of the ring. He examined the stone under different types of light, took measurements with calipers precise to fractions of millimeters, and used something he called a thermal conductivity probe to verify the stone's authenticity. Mrs. Chen and I watched in silence, neither of us daring to interrupt his methodical process. Every few minutes, Dr. Webb would make a note or take a photograph, his expression giving away nothing about what he was discovering. The suspense was killing me, but I forced myself to stay quiet and let him work. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Webb set down his instruments and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Miss Davis, what I'm about to tell you is going to change your life." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Is it real?" "Oh, it's real. And it's spectacular." He gestured to the ring, still sitting on the examination pad under his high-powered lights. "What you have here is a 2.31-carat fancy vivid yellow diamond of exceptional clarity and cut quality. The setting is platinum, as indicated in your 1971 appraisal, and the surrounding stones are indeed genuine white diamonds totaling approximately 0.8 carats. What does that mean in terms of value?" Dr. Webb paused, consulting his notes. "Fancy vivid yellow diamonds of this size and quality are extraordinarily rare. The color saturation is what we call fancy vivid, the highest grade of color intensity for yellow diamonds. The clarity is VS1, which means very slight inclusions that are difficult to see even under magnification. The cut is what appears to be an old European style, probably dating to the 1920s or 1930s. "Dr. Webb," Mrs. Chen interrupted gently, "what is it worth?" He looked at both of us. "Seriously, based on recent auction results for comparable stones and considering the rarity of fancy vivid yellows in this size range, I would estimate the current market value at between $1.2 and $1.5 million. The room spun around me. I gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling over. $1.5 million. The worthless ring that Jessica had tossed at me like a consolation prize was worth more than every other item in my grandmother's estate combined. "Are you absolutely certain?" I managed to ask. "I'm certain enough to stake my professional reputation on it." "Miss Davis, this is one of the finest examples of a fancy, vivid yellow diamond I've ever examined outside of a major auction house or museum collection. Your great-grandmother owned a truly extraordinary piece of jewelry." Dr. Webb spent another 30 minutes explaining the technical details of his evaluation, providing me with a detailed written appraisal and several high-resolution photographs of the ring. He also gave me contact information for insurance companies that specialized in high-value jewelry and auction houses that dealt in rare-colored diamonds. "One more thing," he said as he packed up his equipment. "Given the value of this piece, I strongly recommend that you place it in a secure location immediately. Bank safety deposit box, professional vault, something with serious security. Pieces like this have a way of attracting unwanted attention. After Dr. Webb left, Mrs. Chen and I sat in her shop in stunned silence. The ring, now back in its modest velvet box, seemed to glow with an inner light that I'd never noticed before. Or maybe I was just seeing it with new eyes, eyes that understood what I was actually looking at. "Sarah?" Mrs. Chen said softly. "What are you going to do?" It was a good question. What was I going to do? An hour ago, I'd been Sarah the librarian, the overlooked granddaughter who'd been thrown the family scraps. Now I was Sarah the millionaire, Sarah who owned something that Jessica and Uncle Robert would kill to get their hands on. "I need to talk to a lawyer," I said finally. "I need to understand my legal rights and make sure this ring is protected." "And your family?" I thought about Jessica's smug smile, about Uncle Robert's dismissive attitude, about the years of being treated like the poor relation who should be grateful for whatever crumbs fell from the table. Most of all, I thought about my grandmother, who had trusted her son to handle her affairs and had been systematically robbed by him. My family is going to learn that they made a very expensive mistake. I drove straight to the First National Bank and rented a safety deposit box, placing the ring inside along with copies of all my documentation. The bank manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, was someone I'd known since high school, and she helped me set up the box with maximum security protocols. "Sarah, I have to ask," she said as we completed the paperwork, "is everything okay? You seem different today." I looked at her carefully, wondering how much I should say. Mrs. Rodriguez had always been trustworthy, and given that my mother worked at this same bank, she might already know something about Uncle Robert's activities. "Mrs. Rodriguez, can I ask you something confidentially? Has my Uncle Robert been making any unusual transactions lately? Anything that might have seemed strange or concerning?" Her expression grew serious. "Sarah, you know I can't discuss other customers' account activities with you, but I will say this. If you have concerns about potential financial elder abuse, there are proper channels for reporting those concerns. And if you have evidence of wrongdoing, you should speak with law enforcement." That was as clear a confirmation as I was going to get, without her actually violating bank confidentiality rules. Uncle Robert's activities had been noticed, and they'd raised red flags with people who understood banking regulations. "Thank you," I said. "I think I will be speaking with law enforcement very soon." My next stop was the law office of Patricia Hawkins, the only attorney in Millbrook who specialized in estate law and elder abuse cases. I'd looked her up online during my research that morning, and her credentials were impressive. She'd successfully prosecuted several high-profile cases involving financial exploitation of elderly clients, and she had a reputation for being thorough and aggressive when it came to protecting her clients' rights. Her office was in a renovated Victorian house near the courthouse, much more modern and professional than Mr. Morrison's dusty chambers. When I called from the bank parking lot, her secretary had somehow squeezed me in for a late afternoon appointment, probably because I'd mentioned potential estate fraud and elder abuse. Ms. Hawkins was a woman in her 40s with short auburn hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She listened intently as I laid out the entire story, from the will reading through my mother's revelations to Dr. Webb's appraisal. I showed her all my documentation, including the photographs proving the ring had belonged to my family for decades. "This is quite a situation," she said when I finished. "Let me make sure I understand the key points. Your uncle had power of attorney over your grandmother's affairs, and used that authority to systematically steal from her accounts. He also cleaned out her safety deposit box and sold valuable items without proper documentation or reporting. And now you've discovered that an item he dismissed as worthless is actually worth over $1 million. That's correct. And your cousin Jessica was aware of at least some of her father's activities and helped present this ring to you as if it were a charitable gesture rather than a valuable inheritance." "Yes." Ms. Hawkins leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "Sarah, what you've described constitutes multiple felonies: financial exploitation of an elderly person, theft, fraud, possibly tax evasion if they didn't report the income from selling your grandmother's possessions. The fact that they tried to deceive you about the ring's value could be seen as attempted theft by deception. What can I do about it?" "Several things. First, we need to file a complaint with the district attorney's office. The criminal aspects of this case need to be investigated and prosecuted. Second, we need to file a civil lawsuit to recover the money and property your uncle stole. Third, we need to ensure that your ownership of this ring is legally bulletproof. How do we do that? The documentation you've provided is excellent. The 1971 insurance appraisal establishes the ring's value and your family's ownership. The photographs prove it belonged to your grandmother. The 1998 will specifically bequeathed it to you. And the fact that your uncle inventoried it as unknown value in the safety deposit box records actually works in our favor. It proves he didn't recognize its worth and therefore couldn't have deliberately kept it from you. I felt a surge of relief. So legally, the ring is mine? Based on what you've shown me, yes. But Sarah, I need to warn you about what's coming next. Once your uncle and cousin realize what they've given away, they're going to fight back hard. They'll claim the ring should have been part of the main estate, that there was a mistake in the will, that you somehow deceived them about its value. They'll try every legal maneuver they can think of to get that ring back. Can they succeed? Not if we move quickly and strategically. We need to establish a paper trail that protects your interests before they have a chance to mount a legal challenge. We also need to expose the full extent of your uncle's theft, which will undermine any claims he might make about being the responsible steward of your grandmother's estate. Ms. Hawkins spent the next hour outlining her strategy. She would immediately file a complaint with the DA's office and request a criminal investigation. She would also file for an emergency injunction to freeze any remaining assets from my grandmother's estate until a full accounting could be completed. Most importantly, she would file paperwork formally establishing my legal ownership of the ring based on the documentation I'd provided. There's one more thing we need to discuss, she said as our meeting wound down. Once word gets out about this ring's value, you're going to be thrust into a very public situation. Estate disputes involving millions of dollars tend to attract media attention, especially when they involve family members accusing each other of theft and fraud. I hadn't thought about that. You need to be prepared for your uncle and cousin to try to paint you as a greedy relative who's making false accusations to steal from the family. They'll probably claim that you're taking advantage of an old woman's death to make unfounded accusations against upstanding family members. But I have proof. You do, and that proof is solid. But public relations battles aren't always won with facts. They'll have their own narrative, and it won't be flattering to you. I thought about that as I drove home that evening. In the space of one day, I'd gone from being the overlooked granddaughter to being the center of what was likely to become a very ugly and very public family war. Jessica and Uncle Robert weren't going to quietly accept being exposed as thieves. They were going to fight back with everything they had, and they weren't going to be concerned about collateral damage. But as I pulled into the parking space behind my apartment, I realized that I wasn't afraid anymore. For years, I'd been intimidated by their success, their confidence, their assumption that they knew better than everyone else. Now I knew the truth about how they'd achieved that success. They'd stolen it from an elderly woman who trusted them completely. My phone was ringing as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. The caller ID showed Jessica's number, and my heart rate immediately spiked. This could not be a coincidence. Somehow, word had already gotten back to her about my activities today. I let it go to voicemail, but she called back immediately. Then again. On the fourth call, I answered. "Hello, Jessica." "Sarah!" Her voice was bright and cheerful, but I could hear an undercurrent of tension. "How are you doing, sweetie? I know yesterday was hard for all of us." "I'm fine." "Good, good. Listen, I was thinking about that little ring I gave you yesterday. I realized afterward that I should have been more sensitive about it. Just because it's not worth much doesn't mean it can't have sentimental value, you know?" I said nothing, waiting to see where this was going. "Anyway, I was talking to Daddy, and we think maybe it would be better if that ring stayed with the main jewelry collection. You know, keep all of Grandma's things together. Carol is planning to create a family jewelry display, and it would be nice to have everything in one place." "I see. So I was wondering if I could swing by tomorrow and pick it up. I have some other little things for you, a lovely brooch that belonged to Great-Aunt Margaret, and some vintage costume jewelry that I think you'd really enjoy. Much prettier than that old yellow ring." The casual way she said it made my blood boil. She was trying to trade me costume jewelry for $1 million diamond, and she was doing it with the same condescending tone she'd used all my life. "That's very thoughtful of you, Jessica, but I think I'll keep the ring." There was a pause. "Sarah, you don't understand. This is about preserving the family collection. That ring belongs with the other pieces. According to Grandma's will, it belongs with me." Well, technically, it was just part of the general contents of the hope chest. "I don't think Grandma specifically intended for you to have that particular piece." I almost laughed. She was already starting to rewrite history, exactly as Miss Hawkins had predicted. "Jessica, I've had the ring appraised." Silence. Complete, dead silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, appraised?" Her voice had lost all its false sweetness. "I mean, I took it to a certified gemologist who specializes in rare diamonds. Turns out that worthless ring you gave me is worth about $5 million. I heard what sounded like something dropping, followed by muffled conversation in the background. Jessica was talking to someone, probably Uncle Robert, but she'd covered the phone so I couldn't make out the words. "Sarah," she said when she came back on the line, and now her voice was sharp and cold. "I think there's been a mistake. That ring should have been evaluated as part of the main estate. If it's really valuable, it needs to be distributed according to the proper proportions outlined in Grandma's will." It was distributed according to Grandma's will. She left me the contents of her hope chest, and the ring was in the hope chest. That's not how it works. Valuable items need to be specifically itemized. You can't just claim ownership of million-dollar jewelry because it was mixed in with photo albums. Actually, Jessica, I can. And I have documentation proving that Grandma always intended for me to have this ring, including her 1998 will, which specifically bequeathed it to me. Another silence, longer this time. "We need to meet," Jessica said finally. "This is too important to discuss over the phone. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, at the house on Elm Street. Bring the ring and whatever documentation you think you have. We'll sort this out like adults." "I don't think that's a good idea." "Sarah, don't be naive. This isn't going away just because you want it to. We can handle this as a family, or we can handle it through lawyers and courts and public embarrassment for everyone involved. Which would you prefer?" The threat was clear. Come to the meeting and negotiate, or face a legal battle that would drag our family through the mud. But Jessica didn't know that I'd already consulted a lawyer, that criminal complaints were about to be filed, that her father's theft was about to be exposed. "Fine," I said. 10 o'clock tomorrow. But Jessica, I'm bringing my lawyer." "Your lawyer?" She sounded genuinely shocked. "Sarah, this is family business. Why would you need a lawyer?" "Because this stopped being family business the moment you and Uncle Robert decided to steal from Grandma." I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline. The confrontation I'd been dreading was finally here. Tomorrow morning, I was going to walk into that house as an equal for the first time in my life. Not the poor relation, not the overlooked granddaughter, but someone who had evidence, legal representation, and $1 million ring that proved everything I'd suspected about my family was true. Jessica and Uncle Robert had made their choice when they decided to betray my grandmother's trust. Now they were going to live with the consequences of that choice. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The morning of the confrontation dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I'd barely slept, running through various scenarios in my head, trying to anticipate every argument Jessica and Uncle Robert might throw at me. Miss Hawkins had coached me extensively the night before, reminding me to stay calm, stick to the facts, and let her do most of the talking. But despite her reassurances, my stomach churned with nervous energy as I got dressed. I chose my outfit carefully, a navy blue suit that I'd worn to job interviews, professional but not intimidating. I wanted to look serious and competent, not like the pushover granddaughter they'd always assumed I was. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was putting on armor to face my own family, but that's exactly what this felt like, preparing for battle. Ms. Hawkins picked me up at 9:30, arriving in a sleek black sedan that looked expensive and official. She was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase that matched mine in terms of serious business energy. As we drove toward Grandma's house on Elm Street, she went over our strategy one more time. Remember, Sarah, they're going to try to intimidate you. They'll use family loyalty, guilt, and probably some threats about legal costs and public embarrassment. Don't let them rattle you. We have the stronger position here, both legally and morally. What if they refuse to listen to reason? Then we proceed with the criminal complaint and the civil lawsuit. Honestly, given what your mother told you about your uncle's financial activities, I think that's inevitable, regardless of how this meeting goes. But it's worth giving them a chance to come clean and try to make things right. The house on Elm Street looked different in the morning light, smaller somehow, less imposing than it had seemed during my childhood. Uncle Robert's Mercedes was already in the driveway, along with Jessica's BMW and Carol's white Lexus. Apparently, they'd decided to bring the whole family to this confrontation. Ms. Hawkins and I walked up the front steps together, and I knocked on the door of what had been my grandmother's house for 50 years. Uncle Robert answered, wearing an expensive-looking cashmere sweater and an expression that was supposed to convey concerned authority but mostly just looked annoyed. "Sarah," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "and you must be the lawyer. I have to say, I'm disappointed that family business has come to this." "Mr. Davis," Ms. Hawkins replied smoothly, "I'm Patricia Hawkins, and I think you'll find that theft and elder abuse stopped being family business the moment it became criminal activity." Uncle Robert's face flushed slightly, but he stepped aside to let us in. The living room where I'd spent countless Sunday afternoons with Grandma had been transformed. Furniture was covered with sheets, boxes were stacked against the walls, and the warm, lived-in feeling of the house was gone. It looked like they were preparing to strip it clean and put it on the market as quickly as possible. Jessica was sitting on the couch, looking perfectly put together despite the early hour. Carol sat beside her, and I was surprised to see that the twins, David and Daniel, were there too. This was clearly meant to be a show of family solidarity against the outsider who was threatening their windfall. "Sarah, honey," Carol began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "we're all so sorry about this misunderstanding. I'm sure we can work something out that's fair to everyone." "There's no misunderstanding," I replied, taking the chair Ms. Hawkins indicated. "Uncle Robert stole from Grandma for years, and Jessica tried to trick me into giving away $1 million ring." "Now wait just a minute," Uncle Robert exploded, his careful composure evaporating. "I never stole anything from anyone. I helped your grandmother manage her finances because she asked me to. Everything I did was legal and above board." Ms. Hawkins opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Mr. Davis, I have bank records showing that you transferred over $200,000 from your mother's accounts to your own investments over the past 3 years. Can you explain those transactions?" "Those were loans," he said quickly. "Mom knew about them. She agreed to let me borrow money for some business opportunities that would benefit the whole family. Do you have documentation of these loans? Promissory notes? Repayment schedules? Anything in writing?" Uncle Robert's silence was answer enough. "What about the contents of her safety deposit box?" Ms. Hawkins continued. "According to bank records, you removed valuable jewelry, coins, and securities worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Where are those items now?" "Some of them were sold to pay for Mom's care," Carol interjected. "The nursing home costs, medical bills, things like that." "Mrs. Davis wasn't in a nursing home," I said. "She lived independently in this house until the week before she died, and her medical bills were covered by Medicare and her supplemental insurance." "There were other expenses," Jessica said, jumping into the conversation. "House maintenance, property taxes, day-to-day living costs. Grandma couldn't handle all of that herself anymore." Ms. Hawkins pulled out another document. "According to the records I've obtained, your grandmother's monthly expenses were approximately $3,000. Her Social Security, pension, and investment income totaled over $8,000 per month. She had a surplus, not a deficit. There was no need to sell her possessions to cover living expenses." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Grandma's old mantel clock. Uncle Robert's face had gone pale, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the house. "Even if that's true," Jessica said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "It doesn't change the fact that Sarah is trying to claim ownership of property that should be part of the overall estate. That ring should have been appraised and distributed according to the percentages in Grandma's will." "Actually," Ms. Hawkins said, pulling out yet another document, "the ring was specifically bequeathed to Sarah in your grandmother's 1998 will. Here's a copy." She handed the document to Uncle Robert, who read it with increasing dismay. Jessica leaned over to read it as well, and I watched her face go through a series of expressions: confusion, understanding, and finally, cold fury. "This is an old will," she said finally. "The current will is the one that was read at the lawyer's office. Yes, but this earlier will establishes your grandmother's clear intent regarding the ring. She always wanted Sarah to have it. The question is, why was that specific bequest removed from the final will?" Uncle Robert set the document down carefully, his hands shaking slightly. "Mom changed her mind about a lot of things in her final years. She updated her will several times to reflect her current wishes. Or," Ms. Hawkins said quietly, "someone convinced her to make changes that benefited them at Sarah's expense. Someone who had her trust and her financial power of attorney." "You can't prove that," Carol said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually, Mrs. Davis, I think we can. Your husband systematically isolated your mother-in-law from other family members, convinced her that her memory was failing, and used his position of trust to manipulate her financial and legal decisions. That's textbook elder abuse, and it's a felony." David, one of the twins, spoke up for the first time. "This is crazy. Grandpa Robert would never hurt Grandma Rose. He took care of her. He took care of her money," I said, looking directly at my young cousin. "David, did you know that your grandfather moved over $200,000 from Grandma's accounts into his own investments? Did you know he sold her jewelry and coins and securities without telling anyone? Did you know he lied to her about the family ring being lost so she wouldn't mention it in her will?" David looked confused and upset, glancing between his parents and me as if trying to figure out who to believe. Daniel, his twin, was staring at the floor, looking like he wished he could disappear entirely. "Sarah," Uncle Robert said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, "you don't understand the pressure I was under. The economy was bad. I made some poor investments. The IRS was breathing down my neck. I was going to pay everything back once my financial situation improved." "So you admit it," Ms. Hawkins said. "You admit that you took money from your elderly mother's accounts without her permission." It wasn't like that. She trusted me to handle her finances. I was just borrowing against my inheritance." "Mr. Davis, that's theft. You can't borrow against an inheritance that doesn't exist yet, especially not from someone who's still alive and needs that money for their own care." Jessica stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. "Fine. Let's say Daddy made some mistakes with Grandma's finances. That doesn't give Sarah the right to claim ownership of that ring. It's worth more than everything else in the estate combined. It should be divided proportionally among all the heirs." "The ring was specifically bequeathed to Sarah," Ms. Hawkins repeated patiently. "And it was given to her as part of the hope chest contents, exactly as specified in the final will. She has clear legal ownership." "But we didn't know it was valuable when we gave it to her," Jessica protested. "If we'd known what it was worth, it would have been handled differently." "You mean you would have hidden it or found a way to keep it for yourselves?" I asked. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" "Jessica, you told me it was worthless. You said it was just an old family piece with sentimental value. You were so dismissive about it that I almost didn't even bother having it appraised." "I made a mistake about its value. That doesn't mean you get to keep it." Ms. Hawkins leaned forward. "Miss Davis, are you suggesting that heirs should be able to reclaim gifts from an estate if they later discover those gifts are more valuable than they initially thought? Do you understand the legal chaos that would create? I'm suggesting that this is an extraordinary situation that requires an extraordinary solution." "What kind of solution?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to hear the answer. Jessica returned to her seat, her expression calculating. "We split the ring's value among all the heirs, according to the percentages in Grandma's will. You get your share, about 20%, and the rest of us divide the remainder." "Absolutely not," I said before Ms. Hawkins could respond. "That ring was my great-grandmother's. then my grandmother's, and now it's mine. It's been in our family for 3 generations, and Grandma specifically wanted me to have it. Come on, Sarah, Carol said, trying a different approach. Be reasonable. You're talking about keeping one. $5 million while the rest of us get a few $100,000 each. That doesn't seem fair, does it? What doesn't seem fair is that Uncle Robert stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from Grandma and you all knew about it. We didn't know, Daniel said quietly, speaking for the first time. Mom and Dad, did you really know Grandpa was taking money from Grandma Rose? The silence that followed was deafening. Carol and Uncle Robert exchanged glances, and I could see them trying to figure out how much to admit in front of their sons. It's complicated, Carol said finally. Adult finances are always complicated. It's not complicated, I said, standing up. Your father stole from his elderly mother, and your mother helped cover it up. And when they realized they'd accidentally given away the most valuable thing in the estate, they tried to manipulate me into giving it back. Sarah's right, David said, his voice shaking. This is messed up. Grandma Rose trusted you guys, and you stole from her. We didn't steal anything, Uncle Robert snapped. I managed her finances responsibly during a difficult economic period. Dad, you just admitted that you took her money without permission, Daniel said. How is that not stealing? The family unity that Jessica and Uncle Robert had been counting on was fracturing before our eyes. The twins, who I'd always thought of as spoiled and entitled, were looking at their parents with a mixture of shock and disgust. Miss Hawkins chose that moment to deliver what I suspected was her planned knockout punch. Mr. Davis, I need to inform you that we've filed a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office. Investigators will be reviewing all of your mother's financial records, and they'll be interviewing everyone who had contact with her in her final years. Uncle Robert's face went white. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Financial exploitation of an elderly person is a felony, and based on the evidence we've gathered, you're looking at multiple charges: theft, fraud, elder abuse, possibly tax evasion if you didn't report the income from selling your mother's possessions. What about the ring? Jessica asked desperately. Even if Daddy made some mistakes with the finances, that doesn't resolve the issue of the ring's distribution. Actually, it does, Ms. Hawkins replied. When someone systematically defrauds an estate, they lose any standing to challenge the distribution of that estate's assets. Your father's theft disqualifies him from making any claims about how your grandmother's property should be divided. That's not fair, Carol protested. The ring issue is separate from the financial management issues. No, it's not. It's all part of the same pattern of manipulation and theft. Your husband convinced your mother-in-law to change her will to remove the specific bequest of the ring to Sarah. He did that so the ring would be lumped in with general household items that could be easily overlooked or dismissed. It was all part of his plan to maximize his own inheritance while minimizing Sarah's. I looked around the room at my family, or what was left of it. Uncle Robert was slumped in his chair, looking like a man who'd just realized his world was about to collapse. Carol was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, though I wasn't sure if the tears were real or performed. Jessica was still trying to maintain her composure, but I could see cracks in her facade. The twins looked shell-shocked, as if they were seeing their parents clearly for the first time. There's something else, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Ms. Hawkins has filed for an injunction to freeze all the assets from Grandma's estate, pending a full accounting. That means the house sale is on hold, the investment accounts are frozen, and any money you've already taken will need to be returned. You can't do that, Jessica said, jumping to her feet. We have legitimate expenses, obligations to meet. You can't just freeze everything because of some financial irregularities. I can, and I did. Until we know the full extent of what your father stole, nothing else from that estate is going anywhere. Uncle Robert finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want from us? It was a good question. What did I want? 6 months ago, all I'd wanted was to be treated as an equal member of the family, to have my contributions recognized and valued. Now I realized that I'd been seeking validation from people who had been systematically betraying the person I loved most. I want the truth, I said finally. I want a full accounting of everything you took from Grandma. I want you to return whatever money and property you still have. And I want you to admit what you did, publicly, so that everyone knows the truth about how you treated her. And if we do that, Carol asked, then maybe we can avoid a long, expensive trial that will destroy what's left of this family's reputation. Ms. Hawkins cleared her throat. I should mention that the district attorney's office is pursuing criminal charges regardless of any civil settlement we might reach. Financial elder abuse is a serious crime, and prosecutors don't typically drop charges just because restitution is made. Uncle Robert buried his face in his hands. My God, what have I done? You stole from your own mother, David said, his voice full of anger and disappointment. That's what you did. David, you don't understand the pressure. No, Dad, you don't understand. Grandma Rose was the best person in this family, and you treated her like your personal bank account. That's disgusting. Daniel nodded in agreement. We're ashamed of you. Watching the twins turn against their parents was painful, even though I agreed with their position. These were young men who'd grown up privileged and protected, and they were learning that their comfortable lifestyle had been built on theft and betrayal. Look, Jessica said, clearly trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Maybe we can work out some kind of compromise. Sarah keeps the ring, Daddy pays back what he owes, and we all try to move forward as a family. There is no moving forward as a family, I said. Not after this. You stole from Grandma, lied to me, and tried to cheat me out of my inheritance. The only reason you're talking about compromise now is because you got caught. Sarah, please, Carol begged. Think about what this will do to the family. Think about David and Daniel, how this will affect their futures. I looked at the twins, both of whom were watching me with a mixture of hope and resignation. They were innocent victims in this situation, young men who were about to watch their parents face criminal charges for theft and elder abuse. David and Daniel aren't responsible for their parents' choices, I said. But they're old enough to understand the difference between right and wrong, and they're old enough to know that actions have consequences. What about our college expenses? Daniel asked quietly. If Dad goes to prison, if we lose the house, how are we supposed to finish school? It was a fair question, and one that made my heart ache. These boys had grown up expecting certain things: college educations, comfortable lives, family support. Now all of that was in jeopardy because of their father's greed. Your grandfather set aside money for your education, I said. That money is still there, in the accounts your father hasn't touched yet. Ms. Hawkins is making sure those funds are protected. Relief washed over both twins' faces. At least their futures weren't completely destroyed by their parents' actions. Is there anything else we need to discuss today? Ms. Hawkins asked, checking her watch. I have several more legal filings to complete this afternoon. Just one thing, I said, reaching into my purse. I pulled out a small wrapped package and placed it on the coffee table. Jessica, you mentioned having some vintage costume jewelry for me. I brought you something in return. Jessica looked at the package suspiciously. What is it? Open it. She unwrapped the package to reveal a small jewelry box containing a simple silver ring with a blue stone. It was pretty enough, but obviously not valuable. It's lovely, Jessica said uncertainly, but I don't understand. It's a replacement for the ring you gave me, the one you said was worthless. I thought you might like to have something that actually matches your description. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. I was giving Jessica exactly what she'd tried to give me, a pretty but worthless trinket. The difference was that I was being honest about its value. Keep your ring, Jessica said, setting the box back on the table. I don't want anything from you. That's fine, but understand that this is the last gift that will ever pass between us. After today, we're not family anymore. We're just people who used to know each other. As Miss Hawkins and I prepared to leave, Uncle Robert made one last desperate attempt to reach me. Sarah, your grandmother loved you. But she loved all of us. She wouldn't want this family to be destroyed by money and legal battles. I stopped at the door and looked back at him. You're right. Grandma wouldn't want the family destroyed. But you already destroyed it, Uncle Robert. You destroyed it the first time you stole money from her accounts. You destroyed it when you convinced her that her memory was failing, so you could manipulate her decisions. You destroyed it when you sold her jewelry, and lied to her about what happened to it. I was going to pay everything back. When? After she died and couldn't ask questions anymore? After you'd inherited everything and didn't need to steal anymore? He had no answer for that. As Miss Hawkins and I walked back to her car, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the family relationships that were permanently broken, but relief that the truth was finally out in the open. How do you feel? Ms. Hawkins asked as we drove away from the house. Like I just watched a building burn down, I said. It's terrible and necessary at the same time. The next few months are going to be difficult. There will be depositions, court hearings, probably media attention. Are you prepared for that? I thought about it. A year ago, the idea of being at the center of a public legal battle would have terrified me. Now it just felt like the inevitable conclusion of a story that had started long before I understood what was happening. I'm prepared, I said. More importantly, I'm right. And sometimes being right is more important than being comfortable. 3 weeks later, the local newspaper ran a front-page story about Uncle Robert's arrest on charges of financial elder abuse, theft, and fraud. The headline read, "Local businessman accused of stealing from elderly mother." The article included details about the missing money, the valuable ring, and the pattern of manipulation that had continued for years. Jessica was not charged criminally, but she was named as a defendant in the civil lawsuit seeking restitution for the stolen assets. The house on Elm Street was placed on the market to help cover the damages, and Uncle Robert's business accounts were frozen pending the outcome of the case. I kept the ring, of course. It now sits in a secure safety deposit box, insured for its full value and documented with every piece of provenance information Ms. Hawkins could gather. I've thought about selling it. 1. $5 million is more money than I could spend in a lifetime, but it means more to me than its monetary value. It's proof that my grandmother loved me. It's evidence that her final wish was for me to have something precious, something that connected me to our family's history. And it's a reminder that sometimes the people who appear most successful are really just very good at hiding their crimes. The twins, David and Daniel, reached out to me a few months after their father's sentencing. He received 5 years in prison and was ordered to pay full restitution to the estate. They wanted to apologize for their parents' actions and to thank me for protecting their college funds. We have coffee occasionally now, and while we'll never be close, we've maintained a civil relationship. Jessica and I have not spoken since that day in the living room. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had to sell her Chicago condo to help pay for her legal defense and her share of the restitution. She's moved back to Millbrook and works at a local real estate office, a significant step down from her previous lifestyle. I don't take pleasure in her downfall, but I don't feel guilty about it either. She made her choices just as surely as her father made his. They chose greed over integrity, manipulation over honesty, and theft over respect for an elderly woman who trusted them completely. As for me, I'm still Sarah the librarian, still living in Millbrook, still working at the elementary school. But I'm different now in ways that matter. I'm no longer the overlooked granddaughter who accepts whatever scraps the family throws her way. I'm someone who fought for justice and won, someone who honored her grandmother's memory by refusing to let theft and betrayal go unpunished. The money from the ring's eventual sale, because I did decide to sell it, though not for several years, allowed me to do things I'd never dreamed possible. I started a scholarship fund for local students pursuing education degrees. I bought a small house with a garden where I could grow the flowers my grandmother had loved. And I set aside enough money to ensure that I would never again be vulnerable to the kind of financial manipulation that had been used against Grandma Rose. Most importantly, I learned that being right isn't always comfortable, but it's always worthwhile. Standing up for justice, even when it costs you relationships you thought you valued, is never the wrong choice. And sometimes, the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property. It's the knowledge that someone loved you enough to ensure you were protected, even after they were gone. My grandmother's final gift to me wasn't just a diamond ring. It was the opportunity to discover my own strength, to learn that I was worth fighting for, and to understand that real family isn't about blood relations or shared history. Real family is about people who treat each other with respect, honesty, and genuine love. And by that definition, I'm better off without the family I lost. 5 years later, I stood in the same cemetery where we'd buried Grandma Rose, but this time I wasn't wearing black. The sun was shining brightly, casting long shadows across the well-maintained grounds, and I was there to place fresh flowers on her grave as I did every month. But today felt different somehow, more complete than my previous visits. The legal battles were finally over. Uncle Robert had served 3 years of his 5-year sentence and was now on parole, working at a hardware store in the next town over. His conviction for financial elder abuse had made it impossible for him to work in any capacity involving other people's money, which seemed fitting. The restitution payments would continue for years, but most of Grandma's stolen assets had been recovered and distributed to local charities focused on elder care, as I'd requested. Jessica had quietly left Millbrook after the civil case concluded. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to Florida and was working for a small real estate company there, starting over with a clean slate but a damaged reputation. We'd never spoken again after that confrontation in Grandma's living room, and I was content to keep it that way. Some bridges, once burned, are better left as ashes. The house on Elm Street had been sold, and the proceeds helped cover the legal costs and restitution payments. A young family with 2 small children lived there now, and I sometimes drove by to see the garden they'd planted where Grandma's roses used to grow. It was different but beautiful in its own way, and I liked to think Grandma would have approved of children playing in her backyard again. As for the ring, I'd kept my promise to myself and eventually sold it through one of the auction houses Dr. Webb had recommended. The final sale price was even higher than his initial estimate. $1.8 million, due to what the auctioneer called an exceptional example of a fancy, vivid yellow diamond with impeccable provenance. The story of how the ring had been discovered and the legal battle that followed had actually increased its value among collectors who appreciated both its beauty and its dramatic history. I used part of the money to establish the Rose Davis Memorial Scholarship Fund, which provided college assistance to students from small towns who wanted to pursue careers in education or social work. The fund had already helped 12 young people attend college, and seeing their graduation photos reminded me why Grandma had always valued education and service to others. Another portion went toward purchasing a small house just outside Millbrook, with enough land for the garden I'd always dreamed of having. I grew vegetables and flowers, kept a few chickens, and discovered that working with my hands in the soil was remarkably therapeutic after years of dealing with lawyers, in courtrooms, and family drama. But the most significant change wasn't financial, it was personal. The quiet librarian who had accepted whatever scraps the family threw her way was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to settle for less than she deserved. It had taken a betrayal and a legal battle to teach me that lesson, but it was a lesson worth learning. I'd also learned something important about forgiveness. I didn't forgive Uncle Robert and Jessica because they deserved it, or because it would make me feel better. I forgave them because carrying anger and resentment was exhausting, and I had better things to do with my energy. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing their actions. It meant choosing not to let their choices continue to poison my life. My relationship with my mother had grown stronger through the ordeal. Her decision to finally speak up about Uncle Robert's theft had been difficult for her, but it had also freed her from years of guilt and fear. She'd retired from the bank and now volunteered at the local literacy center, teaching adults how to read. We had lunch every Sunday, and she often mentioned how proud she was of the way I'd handled everything. The twins, David and Daniel, had both graduated from college despite their father's disgrace. They'd used their education funds wisely, studying business and psychology respectively, and both had landed good jobs in nearby cities. We maintained a cordial relationship, meeting for coffee when they visited Millbrook, and I was proud of how they'd chosen to define themselves by their own actions rather than their father's crimes. David had even written me a letter during his senior year, thanking me for protecting their college funds and expressing his regret about his parents' actions. He wrote that watching the legal proceedings had taught him the importance of integrity and honest dealing, lessons that had shaped his approach to business. It was one of the most mature and thoughtful letters I'd ever received from someone his age. As I arranged the fresh lilies on Grandma's grave, I thought about all the ways my life had changed since that day in the lawyer's office when Jessica had handed me what she thought was a worthless ring. The irony still amazed me. In trying to cheat me out of my rightful inheritance, she'd actually given me something far more valuable than money. She'd given me the opportunity to discover my own strength. The legal victory had been satisfying, but the personal growth that came from standing up for myself had been transformative. I'd learned that being kind and quiet didn't mean I had to accept mistreatment. I'd discovered that fighting for justice, even when it was uncomfortable and costly, was always the right choice. And I'd realized that real family wasn't about blood relations or shared history. It was about people who treated each other with respect and genuine care. These days, my chosen family included Mrs. Chen, who had become a close friend and mentor, Ms. Hawkins, who still called occasionally to check on me and share stories about her other cases, and a small group of colleagues and neighbors who valued honesty and kindness over wealth and status. It was a smaller circle than the extended family I'd once been part of, but it was infinitely more meaningful. I'd also started dating again, something I'd never had much confidence about before. There was a man named Tom who worked at the local farmer's market, selling organic produce and honey from his own farm. He was quiet like me, but with a gentle sense of humor and a deep appreciation for simple pleasures. He'd never heard of fancy yellow diamonds or estate litigation, and he didn't care that I'd once been involved in a highly publicized legal battle. He liked me for who I was now, not for what I'd inherited or what I'd overcome. Our relationship was still new, but it felt healthy and honest in ways that my family relationships never had. Tom treated me as an equal partner, someone whose opinions and feelings mattered. He never made me feel like I should be grateful for his attention or that I needed to minimize myself to make him comfortable. It was a revelation to discover that romantic relationships could be based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics and manipulation. Standing there in the cemetery, with the afternoon sun warming my face and the sound of birds singing in the trees overhead, I felt a deep sense of peace that had been missing from my life for years. The battles were over, the truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. More importantly, I'd found my voice and learned how to use it. I pulled a folded letter from my purse, one I'd written to Grandma but never intended to send. It was something my therapist had suggested, a way to process all the emotions and revelations of the past few years. I read it silently, a final conversation with the woman who had loved me enough to ensure I was protected even after she was gone. Dear Grandma, the letter began, I wanted you to know that your final gift taught me more than just the value of a beautiful diamond. It taught me the value of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. It taught me that love sometimes means making hard choices to protect the people we care about. And it taught me that true strength comes not from avoiding conflict, but from facing it with integrity and courage. I folded the letter carefully and placed it among the flowers. A gentle breeze stirred the grass around the headstone, and for a moment I could almost hear Grandma's voice telling me how proud she was of the woman I'd become. As I walked back to my car, I thought about the future. There would be new challenges, new relationships to navigate, new opportunities to stand up for myself and others. But I faced them with confidence now, knowing that I had the strength to handle whatever came my way. The ring was gone, sold to a collector, who would appreciate its beauty and rarity. The money had been put to good use, helping young people pursue their dreams and supporting causes that mattered to me. The family relationships that had defined my early life were permanently changed, some broken beyond repair, and others stronger than before. But the most important thing remained, the knowledge that I was worthy of love, respect, and honesty, that I deserved to be treated well, and that I had the power to demand nothing less. That lesson, more than any inheritance or legal victory, was Grandma's true final gift to me. And it was a gift I plan to use every day for the rest of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.